I'm really, really excited to bring to the stage next a gentleman who's been in the industry as it relates to high performance computing for nearly a decade, has worked with some amazing companies, but most recently was part of the Heptio team that was very strategically acquired by VMware. So I'd like to bring him up to the stage, Paul Lundin from VMware, Director of Kubernetes Architecture. Paul.
I don't need that. How's everybody doing? Hopefully you're having a little bit of fun with the silent radio thing. I've used these at a couple of different events over the past couple of years, and I think they're pretty fun, and they segue nicely into what I want to talk about. Music, not Kubernetes, right? Or at least I'll get there in a minute. So all of us have kind of heard music throughout our lives, going back to childhood lullabies that your parents might have sung to you before you went to bed at night, all the way to your favorite songs today, here and now. And I kind of want you to hold one of those songs in your mind and think about what makes it your favorite song. And how, as a species, humans got to the point where we were composing music that was that complex, right? That layered. And you think about that and you say, music is interesting. An interesting thing about music is that it predates written language, right? Our species has been using music to communicate for literally eons, 40,000 plus years. And over those 40,000 plus years, we've gotten to the point where Nine Inch Nails or Nirvana, right, Moby or whoever your preferred artist or genre is, has come to be a way where we can all universally say, that's a good jam. Let's groove to that. Well, how does this relate to Kubernetes? A couple of things happened along the way as we were developing music as a species, as kind of our universal language, if you will, that pivoted the direction of music, right, that kind of accelerated its growth. Now, the first thing that happened prior to the written word, prior to parchment or papyrus being used, right, was the carving of musical notes into stone tablets, right? Now, back at that point in time, there was no rhythm, there was no harmony, there was no composition, no orchestration. It was just a chant, a very simple, very primal thing. And it was found all over the world. It was found in China, it was found in the Middle East, right? Native Americans had their versions of music 10, 20,000 years ago. That was very important. That's very similar to technology, right? Now, we're a very nascent industry, 40, 50 years, depending on how you want to measure it, right? But those initial systems that we built with COBOL, Fortran, mainframe systems, they were very much like a primal chant, right? We need to do this very simple mathematical thing, this very simple transaction, right? It's not a complex system. Now you fast forward a couple of eons, a couple of millennia, and music starts getting much more complex. You start finding woodwind instruments. You start finding percussion instruments. All of a sudden, the music becomes layered, but it's still somewhat chaotic. And then, and this will speak to many of you, along comes this concept of a composer, right? And the concept of a composer is that it would tell the percussion instruments, you play this note, you play it at this tempo, you play it at this pitch. And then they would tell the woodwind instruments, and later on, in our human evolution, as we came up with brass instruments, instruct them, and so on and so forth. And all of a sudden, music became much more complex, much richer, right? Much like the systems and technology that we work with every day. And the second and very influential thing that happened with music was actually the written music, right? Sheet music. When that started becoming common, right, about 1,000 years ago, roughly, depending on whose estimate you go with, all of a sudden it became common for, or simple for someone in a different culture, in a different place, in a different era, to play the same music. Something that was never possible before. If you go back to those stone tablets, well, you do have the music there, it is captured. It's more like a cacophony of noise than it is an orchestra, right? Now, why am I talking about music? And why am I talking about orchestras and composers? Well, if you start looking at what this stuff represents to humanity and the technology that we all work on a day-to-day basis, you'll start to see corollaries. So that sheet music, when that became the nom de France kind of like nomenclature that was used everywhere, right? That allowed music to blow up. It became popular, right? It became something that the average person over time could pick up and learn. You can go to the store right now and buy sheet music. 1,200 years ago, 1,300 years ago, that was not an option. So you might have heard music if you were a peasant or a commoner in Europe or Asia or Africa, but you would not be able to play music, especially not music that someone else had created. Now you can. Now it's common. Well, technology is going the same way with the rise of cloud computing, with the rise of the phones that you have in your pocket, right? Computing is becoming much more common. But what we don't have still today, especially at the infrastructure level, is any sort of sheet music equivalent, right? Something that tells you this note should be played at this tempo, right, in this way. And we definitely don't have a composer for your technology, right? If you go into your environment, you don't have one person that's telling your systems administrators, your woodwind instruments, if you will, to play it at this tempo. Not telling your percussion people, your drum and bass people, play it at this tempo. This is where Kubernetes actually comes into play. Now, Kubernetes doesn't solve all of your problems, but very similar to a composer, it can help with a lot of it, right? It can help orchestrate how your applications are deployed. It can help orchestrate where those applications are deployed or why, right? A node failure results in more applications being deployed. Very much like the composer that sits there and tells the orchestra at what tempo should they be playing. Should you stop? Should you go? Kubernetes actually has all of those mechanics built in for software. And it does it both for the application and for the infrastructure. But singularly, the most important part of Kubernetes isn't so much that it orchestrates your applications, right? You could find that out 30 seconds Google, right? What is the most important thing is that sheet music. It's a common API that is standardized, that everybody in your environment, regardless of what cloud provider they're running on, can use to talk about what's going on in the environment. This actually allows you to take that cacophony of noise, right, the very primitive music, the very primitive chants that might have been common 10,000, 20,000 years ago, and to start to turn it into a Nine Inch Nails song, or a Johnny Cash song, right, or a Nirvana, whatever your preferred thing is. I'm more of a rock person, personally. So when you start thinking about that, right, and the nature of music being the universal language for all of us, regardless of where you're from, we all know what a good beat is, we all know what a good song is. Sometimes even if you don't speak the language that the singer is singing in, you can feel their heartbreak, right? Kubernetes provides you with a similar kind of Rosetta Stone for infrastructure and applications. And that's what we're aiming for, right? A way for you to do what Jing talked about, right? Where you can modernize your environment onto something like Kubernetes, start orchestrating very complex concepts, right? In a very common, portable, and universal way. That is a very, very powerful thing for every enterprise out there in existence. And I hope that the song that I told you to hold in your mind, you can start to break that down into different parts and think about how that aligns with the technology environment that you're working in today, right? Regardless of what business you're in, whether it's an insurance company or financial services, whether it's a food service distributor like who spoke earlier on the stage today, there is some commonality there, right? Where you can actually leverage the growth and the maturation of something like music and line it up with the technology and take advantage of the same kind of concepts, right? Be that composition of that music, right? What does the application architecture need to look like? Be that the tempo of the music, right? Or the volume at which it's played, right? How busy is your environment? How much capacity do you need, right? Where should your applications live? Should you spin down your environment based on business demand, right? All of those sorts of things are very similar to music in that you might want to play this louder. You might want to change this part of this orchestra to be played by a string instrument rather than a woodwind, right? Very simple, basic concepts. And that would be, to me, the most valuable part of Kubernetes in kind of transforming enterprises. It gives you that standard common language and standard common framework that you can apply anywhere. So hopefully that's a little bit of a prelude to where we're going to go with the next session, which I'll have Mike come up and introduce. Thank you.